Hey there, church family. This is week 8 of the E100 reading plan, and we looked at the kings of Israel. Last week ended on a high note. David was given an amazing promise that he would have an eternal dynasty. His kingdom would last forever, and he would have a son who would reign on the throne for all time. This week, by contrast, we watched as through a series of actions, the nation is first split in half, and then later is sent into exile. So first, we began with David. And David lusts after Bathsheba. Bathsheba is the wife of Uriah, and Uriah is a trusted officer and a mighty man in David's army. David's lust led him to commit adultery. And David tries to deceive Uriah so that he doesn't get caught, but that doesn't work, so he has Uriah put to death. These kind of actions, by the way, were not uncommon for kings in nations surrounding Israel. Right? Israel asked for a king like the nations. Well, this would not be uncommon for those kings to do this kind of evil thing. But this is not how the king in covenant with God is to act. When confronted by Nathan, David repents and pleads to God for mercy. We read more about that in Psalm 51. And as a result, God doesn't count his sin against him. David's sin is covered by God's grace, but there's consequences for David's action. Back in the Davidic covenant in 2 Samuel 7, God said that if the king sins, he says, I will punish him with the rods of men. And the result in David's case is twofold. In the short term, the son born to Bathsheba will die. But in the long term, David says, the sword will never depart from your house. God will remove peace from David's family. We didn't read the rest of the book of Samuel, but much of it records just this kind of fighting. David's sons fighting amongst himself and a resulting civil war and the destruction that comes with it. But there's another son born to David and Bathsheba, Solomon. This son born of an illicit union might not be our first choice of a ruler, but God's electing choice is unpredictable. And God renames Solomon beloved of Yahweh. The book of Kings then begins with David dying and passing on the throne to Solomon after giving him parting instructions on how to bring security and peace to the nation that was divided as a result of David's sins. But in order to rule properly, Solomon asks God for wisdom. He understands that he can't do this on his own, and he must look to the Lord to give him discernment. The result is a high point in Israel's history, with abundant wealth in the nation and foreign kings and queens coming to admire the nation. We read in 1 Kings 4, it says, he had peace on all sides around him, and Judah and Israel lived in safety from Dan to Beersheba, every man under his vine and under his fig tree in all the days of Solomon. In this time, we see the construction of the temple that David had wanted to build. And in chapter 8 and 9, we read about the temple's dedication and Solomon's prayer when that happened. This is a symbol of God's presence dwelling with the nation. Solomon's prayer focuses on how this can be a place where the people turn to look for forgiveness and to seek God's face, whether in a time of pestilence or drought. And in a prophetic way, Solomon prays that even if the people are taken into exile, if they turn towards the temple, a symbol of turning back to the Lord and remembering him, he would hear their cry and forgive them. Some 400 years later, this passage would be very relevant to the people of Judah when they're living in Babylon. This high point in Israel's history began to fade even in chapter 3, when Solomon makes marriage alliances with Egypt by marrying Pharaoh's daughters. As Solomon's life goes on, he is led away from the wisdom that he was given. And because of his many wives, he's led into idolatry, a sin for which God divides the nation in half. After Solomon, Israel is now two nations because of Solomon's sin. The northern is called Israel now, and the southern is called Judah. The southern nation of Judah is ruled by kings from David's line. Some of them good, some of them seek the way of the Lord, but many of them are evil and lead the people astray. The northern nation, by contrast, is entirely idolatrous. All of our kings are wicked, and they all promote idolatry and lead the people into sin. We read one of those kings is Ahab. We read about him, Ahab, son of Omri, who ruled in Samaria, the capital of the northern wicked nation called Israel. And the prophet Elijah is sent to confront Ahab. Because of Ahab's sin and the sin of the people, there's a great drought that God sends. Meanwhile, Elijah is sent away to a Gentile city to miraculously provide for a Gentile widow and her son. Jesus, by the way, tells us that this event was a sign of judgment on Israel, as God has sent Elijah away from his people to take care of a Gentile, to the people of Zarephath of the Sidonians. Then there's this amazing showdown between Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and God shows who he is. But Elijah gets really depressed because despite his ministry and the calling he has to this nation, it seems like this entire nation is in wickedness and evil. And he wonders, what's the point? What am I even doing here? And God comes to Elijah and says, I have yet 7,000 in Israel who have not bowed the knee to Baal. Paul later uses that verse in the book of Romans in an argument to show that God always has his elect people. Even if the whole nation has turned away, God still has his people. And this can be a reminder to us. When we think of this story, or maybe when you looked at the time of the judges and saw the great wickedness in the land at that time, or here when we see that the whole nation seems to be diving headlong into sin and running towards exile, we need to remember that God still has his people. Even if they're vastly outnumbered and the nation as a whole is in rebellion, God has his people who remain faithful to him. God has not forgotten, and he has his people still. But eventually, the nation of Israel is sent into exile. The northern nation is sent first and is taken by the Assyrians. We didn't read that, but we did read 2 Samuel 25. And after generations of unfaithfulness and evil, God decides to send the southern nation of Judah into exile. And we read in 2 Kings 25 that Nebuchadnezzar comes against Jerusalem. And in the summer of 587 BC, he destroys the temple which Solomon built. And he drags the people off into exile, and so began 70 years of captivity for the people. But the book of Kings ends on a note of hope. Jehoiachin, a king in the line of David, while still in exile, is released from prison and is shown special favor by the king of Babylon. And he lives there the rest of his life, but he's raised up just a little bit above the rest of the kings there. Not a super high note for the people, but a sign that God's promise to David has not been forgotten. David's line has not been wiped out. Even in exile, there's this little glimmer of hope. In all this week's reading, we saw great heights, peace in Israel, God dwelling in his temple, abundant peace, but slowly this is taken away as the people turn from God, until at the end, they're in exile. The temple is destroyed. The people are oppressed and far from home. But also, throughout, God has had his people. And not all has been lost. But God is going to have to work a miracle if the people are to be restored from exile and a king is to be put back on the throne of David. What did you find interesting in this week's reading? What was an encouragement to you? And let me know in the comments, and thanks for joining us on this E100 reading plan. See you next week.